Morning, everyone. As Ted mentioned, my name is Dr. Joe Shin, Lead Regulatory Health Project Manager within the Division of Project Management. I'm extremely excited to be here today. I see all these faces, some that I've never seen before as my time as an RPM, but again, I'm extremely excited. Several months ago, I was approached by my leadership to see if I'd be interested in speaking at this SBIA event, and I jumped at the opportunity. I'd like to tell you that I agree to be a presenter because I enjoy speaking in front of everyone, but I'll be honest with you, I'd be lying if that was the case. I am always nervous when I sit in front of a group of people, so please bear with me today. But to be truthful, I agree because events such as this are a great way for FDA and industry to get together and share information. Ultimately, we want to help facilitate the development and approval of safe, affordable generic drugs to the American public. Now, certainly that's an event I'd like to be a part of. And so that is why I am so thankful to be here today to speak to you all. Now, with that being said, thank you so much for having me. I hope to provide you with some helpful information about my particular topic, request for reconsideration. I'll speak to you about the process, give a brief overview, and also some of the best practices to consider to ensure your RfR, or request for reconsideration, which I'll call it an RfR throughout this presentation, will be acceptable for FDA evaluation. So what is it that I hope to accomplish in this presentation? Well, first, I want to make sure that I explain the purpose of the request for reconsideration at the division level under GDUFA. I want to also go further into describing what is an appropriate matter for a request for reconsideration. That's extremely important because there's only specific things that one could request for reconsideration. And I'll go into more detail on that throughout the presentation. Next, I want to also provide an overview, a high-level overview of the RfR process, and outline how to submit an RfR for FDA evaluation. And lastly, I'll share common reasons why RfRs have recently been deemed not acceptable for FDA evaluation, and also identify the best practices to consider when you're ready to submit an RfR for FDA evaluation. Now, before I dive into the presentation, I want to sort of gauge the audience's level of experience with RfRs. So I'll pose my first poll question, or my only poll question. So how many of you, by a raise of hands, had submitted a request for reconsideration? Anyone? Okay. It's a couple of you, yeah. How many of you, by a raise of hand, have never submitted an RfR but plan to do so maybe in like the next month or two? Okay. And lastly, how many of you have never submitted an RfR and have no intention of submitting right now at all? I guess that might be a good thing, right? Well, it looks like we have a mixed bag of responses, which is great. Now, for me, I can assure you that information that I share with you all today can be helpful regardless if you're familiar with the RfR process or not, all right? So I want to thank you all for your responses and your participation. Now that I have a feel for the audience's familiarity of the RfRs, let's go back to my slides. So what is the purpose of an RfR? Well, it's a request that was created to ensure open and prompt consideration of an applicant's concerns regarding certain actions that relate to your ANDA and have scientific significance. Now, during the assessment of an ANDA, FDA considers important issues that are central to product evaluation. Now, there are going to be times when an applicant might disagree with the FDA. And because these disagreements have involved intricate, complex matters, it's important to have a process such as this in place, right? Now, although we have this process, it doesn't mean that we are opening this process up to any and all matters. So I just want to make sure you guys are aware of that. Which brings me to my next slide. Before we can submit an RfR, we need to know what matters are appropriate for an RfR. As I mentioned in the previous slide, RfRs are requests submitted by applicants for agency to reconsider concerning certain actions with scientific significance. Now, FDA regulatory actions that relate to an ANDA and have scientific significance is certainly a matter that can be handled through the RfR process. Those regulatory actions include complete response letters. In my experience, I've seen RfR submitted in reconsideration of a major classification of a complete response letter, just as an example. Next, we have classification of a major amendment to an ANDA or a prior approval supplement. This could be where an applicant seeks reconsideration or classification of a major CRL response that they've submitted. Next, we have the classification of the standard assessment status of an ANDA, an ANDA amendment, prior approval supplement, or prior approval supplement amendment. This may be an instance where an applicant seeks reconsideration of the standard assessment status of their ANDA amendment, where they believe the assessment status shouldn't be a standard, but more like a priority. Now, I bolded these points to the 3 actions here because they're most often seen in the RfR space. They're not the only ones, though. The remainder of the list that I'm showing here are other regulatory actions that are appropriate matters for an RfR, although we see them less frequently. A request for reconsideration of an acknowledgement letter. Well, when applicants seek reconsideration of the assessment classification of a major amendment, it is upon receiving that major acknowledgement letter when applicants can submit their RfR requests for those particular items. Information requests and discipline review letters are also considered not regulatory actions. So this brings me to our first challenge question. Now that I've gone through the purpose of the RfR and the appropriate matters which applicants can submit at RfR, let's take a moment to test your knowledge. All right. So which of the following are inappropriate matters for an RfR? Choice A major classification of a CRL, major to minor. B, a standard assessment status of a CRL response amendment, standard to priority. C, major acknowledgement letter of a discipline review letter, response amendment, major to minor. Or D, advice communicated in a general advice letter. I'm just going to check with the audience. For those that think A is the correct answer, show of hands, please. Okay. Who thinks it's B? Show of hands. Okay. C? Okay. Lastly, D. Okay. Looks like I'm getting a resounding response of D. Well, the answer is, in fact, D. Now, answer choices A, B, and C are all appropriate matters in which one could submit an RfR, as I've outlined in the previous slides. With regards to choice D, D is considered to be an inappropriate matter, as a general advice letter is not considered a regulatory action. Now, before I go into how to submit an RfR, I want to make sure I spend some time to go over the RfR process at a high level. The diagram I have here starts at the left, where an applicant's going to submit their RfR. It is at the diamond to the right of it, where the agency would take a very preliminary look into the request, simply to see if the RfR meets all the criteria outlined within the request for reconsideration final guidance, which went final in October of 2024. Now, if the request does not meet the recommendations in the final guidance, we'll navigate down, and the applicant will receive a not accept letter. In that not accept letter, the agency will include information as to why the RfR was not acceptable for FDA evaluation. So extremely helpful for industry to know exactly what it is that they need to fix in the event they decide to submit a subsequent RfR request. Now, if the request does meet the recommendations outlined in the final guidance, then we'll navigate to the right, where an applicant will receive an accept letter or an RfR acknowledgement letter, which is also known as. That will be issued. And if your RfR is found acceptable for evaluation, we'll move downstream to the right in the diagram to the second diamond, where a review of the points made in the RfR will be evaluated. Now, it is here where the disciplines involved in the matter will review that information, as well as the original signatory authority that signed off on that regulatory action. It is then determined if the points are made in the RfR are valid or not. And at that point, a decisional letter will be issued with either a grant or deny decision. So for today's presentation, I really want to focus right here in the left side of the flowchart. And the reason why is we have the biggest opportunity for improvement right where does RfR meet the guidance. By making sure we follow the RfR guidance, we can see more RfRs be deemed acceptable for FDA evaluation and therefore minimize the administrative burden shouldered by both industry and the agency as a result of subsequent requests. So getting it right the first time brings applicants closer to a decisional letter on the matter they seek reconsideration for. So now we'll jump into how to submit an RfR. When submitting RfR, you want to identify the matter you seek reconsideration and include adequate information to explain the nature of the eligible request. You want to also make sure that you submit your RfR within 7 calendar days from the date of the regulatory action taken by the FDA. Now, doing so may lead to an assigned RfR GDUFA goal date, especially when it is for a reconsideration request that involves a major classification or a standard assessment. You also want to submit the RfR as a separate standalone submission to the ANDA. As an example, if an RfR is submitted together with your CRL response, the RfR will be deemed not acceptable for FDA evaluation. So you want to make sure that you separate those two out. Now, with the RfR guidance going final in October of 2024, you want to make sure that you follow the content and format section of the final guidance, with an emphasis on identifying the submission clearly on the 356H form, as well as the cover letter. You want to make it extremely evident to the agency that that's exactly what you're submitting. You also want to provide a brief but comprehensive statement of each matter to be resolved in the cover letter. Also include a statement identifying the office that issued the decision on the matter you request reconsideration for, whether it be the Office of Generic Drugs or the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. Next, provide a list of documents previously submitted to the ANDA that are deemed appropriate for the resolution of your request for reconsideration. You also want to include dates of those documents if you do include them in your RfR request so that they can be readily located by the agency in the ANDA file. Sorry. And lastly, provide a statement with no new information or analysis has been submitted in support of your request. That's an important one as well, as information that's been given that wasn't available to the original signatory authority at the time of that regulatory action would not be acceptable, and you will receive a non-accept RfR. So I'm just going to give you a breakdown of some of the most recent reasons we've seen RfRs be not accepted for applicants. So 1, RfR did not include information specified within the bulleted list of the content and format section of the RfR guidance. This has been one that we've seen often recently with the guidance going final. 2, the RfR has not been submitted as a standalone separate submission. And lastly, a key one that we've always have seen is the RfR including new information and new analysis that have not been considered before the FDA took action related to your RfR. And again, like I said before, the original signatory is basing their decision-making on the information that was already in the ANDA file. By presenting new information during the RfR space wouldn't be appropriate. So here are some best practices I can share from my experience as a subject matter expert on the request for reconsideration process. First, you want to make sure to clearly state what it is that you're requesting. Make sure that the matter in question is appropriate. I've listed 2 examples here that are most commonly seen in the RfR space, which is a major to minor classification or a standard to priority classification. Next, ensure that the RfR process is the appropriate path. Now, as an example, there are instances where applicants may receive a major CRL, solely major, due to a facility deficiency, which may be best suited via the reclassification of facility-based major CRL amendment, as opposed to the RfR process. Make sure you determine which path is right for you and for your situation. Provide a brief but comprehensive statement of the matter that you request to be resolved. In major to minor classifications, it's not enough to simply state you want reconsideration of minor because it doesn't require a large expenditure of FDA resources and time. Make sure you're making robust points to the agency for consideration in your request. Next, make sure, again, and I can't harp on this more, make sure you look at the RfR guidance and address all the components outlined within the content and format section of the RfR guidance. And again, no new information in your RfR requests, just to make sure that that information isn't included because the original signatory did not consider that information at the time of regulatory action. Lastly, refer to the final guidance for industry request for reconsiderations at the division level under GDUFA. October 2024 was the time that it went final. And at that time, the current thinking is to follow that final guidance and submit your RfRs based on the information that you see there. Now that I'm approaching the conclusion of my presentation, I think it's a good time to test your knowledge one last time. So I'll start. Which one of the following will not result in an RfR not accepted letter? A, new information, new analysis. B, does contain the information specified in the bulleted list in the content and format section. C, not submitted as a separate amendment. Or D, advice given to applicants in meetings or teleconferences. Any takers for A? No. Takers for B? I heard a B. Yeah, all right. Got a lot of hands for that one. Takers for C? No. And my assumption is no takers for D? All right. You guys are all correct. B is the answer. When you do have an RfR that does contain the information specified in the bulleted list in the content and format section of RfR guidance, and also meet the remaining criteria within that guidance, you should receive an RfR accepted letter. Now here I've just given several links just to resources in the event that you're ready to submit a request for reconsideration. Final guidance link is listed here. And I've also included the GDUFA 3 commitment letter as it outlines the congressional metrics involved with the request for reconsideration. Now, in summary, RfRs can be found acceptable for FDA evaluation if we keep in mind the following. Follow that RfR guidance and especially the content and format section. Make sure that you guys are submitting RfRs for an appropriate matter. Refer to the RfR final guidance for assistance. And lastly, addressing these areas of improvement will reduce the administrative burden, not only for the agency, but also for industry. To submit an RfR and have it not accepted and then have to subsequently submit it again is something that we want to reduce and mitigate the risk of. And so my hope is that through this presentation, we'll see an increase in more RfR accepted letters the first time around. So thank you so much for your time. As I mentioned to Brenda, I am a first-time SBIA, and so I'm thankful to be here. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have during the Q&A panel. Now I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Yi Zhang from Office of Bioequivalence.